little copies. I'm going to leave early to go hear the inaugural sermon of the new rabbi, B'nai Yeshua. Yeah. But just remember my 11th commandment that they asked for the, and I mentioned.
Alter Mishkan Tefillah.
Yeah, but no, I also mentioned, I mentioned, the prayer book here.
Nice.
Yeah, so it just, they put it up on the little wall with 10 or 15 other things, and the new rabbi over there is really good,
Yeah, no, he's a good guy.
He got down on his hands like this so he could read it on the little thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I want to go hear his inaugural.
He's a fine fellow.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. You doing okay?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Rabbi Klein, do we know this person? Do we know this person?
Morning. Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So good to see you. Let me thank those who have participated in our Bagel Plus adventure. Thanks to Marie Smith for the bagels this morning in honor of Frank Bittanti. And thanks to Doris Donnelly for sponsoring the live stream. And Doris, you also picked up this morning? Okay, I'm assuming that's a yes. Good, okay, excellent, thank you. Excuse me, I wanted to do something else. Annual meeting this Sunday, tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the sanctuary. And it's going to be a moving last annual meeting of the Temple-Tifereth Israel. We are now in the process of doing the last of a lot of things. But in our tradition, endings are preludes to new beginnings. I'm going to talk about that a little bit tomorrow in my invocation. We end the reading of the Torah and we begin right again with the beginning. When Pesach is over, we begin to look to Shavuot, and we count the days until we have the revelation on Mount Sinai. So endings are difficult, but in our tradition, endings are preludes, are foundations for something new. So I think it's great for us to celebrate our 174 years and to, in some way, lament the passing of something we've been used to. On the other hand, we look forward to a very bright future for Mishkan Or and our collaboration with Fairmont Temple. Let me thank Jim Mezzi for pinch hitting for me last week. Thank you so much. I always hear good things, and I really appreciate the seriousness with which everybody who agrees to do this takes the assignment. So it's always wonderful for me to know that we're in good hands, even if I'm not here. So thanks so much, Jim, as always. A blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Welcome to those who are live streaming. I have my soon-to-be-ignored restate the questions. 3x5 laminated card. No, it's more 3x8. But I've got it right in front of me, and I'm going to try to notice it. As I'm sure you understand, once we get immersed in discussion, nothing else is in existence but our conversation. So I'm going to have to pay some attention. Okay, so this week and then next week ends our June Torah study, and we're going to continue into July and August, as I have mentioned, because we're hoping that some people from Fairmont Temple will want to join us and begin again. So that's what we're going to be doing. Okay, so we are looking at the prophet Amos. Anybody have the page? Let me just quickly review what we've done. 1022?
Yeah.
1022?
Yeah.
1022.
Where do you want to go? 5, 4, 3?
Oh, we're going to start at the beginning.
Oh, the beginning, okay. That's 10:15.
Okay, 10:15? Yep. Okay, so one thing to know, which we haven't mentioned yet, is that in the early years of Reform Judaism, and you may know that Reform Judaism, in its inception, which was trying to make a kind of connection between the Jewish tradition and the modern world. I often think in terms of a continuum, let's say from 0 to 100. 100 is a community that, for whom its culture is 100% Jewish. This is all Jewish. At the other end of the continuum is all modern world. Okay? So all Jewish may represent or reflect or illustrate medieval Judaism, when the Jews were more or less barricaded behind ghetto walls, and their entire life was animated by Jewish concerns, Jewish law, Jewish life. This is not 100% true, but let's say that it is. 0 represents full assimilation into the society and culture of the outer world, okay? Full immersion in Judaism and nothing else. No Judaism and totally trying to immerse in modern culture. So, and I think we can array modern forms of Judaism along that continuum. The Orthodox are closer to 100. The Hasidim, the intense Orthodox, are even closer still to 100. Modern Orthodoxy, let me just arbitrarily put a number to it. Modern Orthodoxy at 80. Okay? Because modern Orthodoxy also wants to be involved to some degree in the modern world. Yeshiva University, the motto of Yeshiva University is Torah Umada. Torah and learning and general learning and science. So they were trying to make some kind of a connection between the two. Reform Judaism, in its inception, was not at 0, but let's put it at 10, 15, 20. I don't want to be unfair, But Reform Judaism, under the sway of the ideology of the Enlightenment, and think about the word enlightenment, which obviously has the word light in it. Enlightenment is not just a description of Enlightenment culture, it's also a polemic. What's the opposite of light? Dark. The Enlightenment was an attempt to emerge from the darkness of, guess what? The Dark Ages, right? The Dark Ages filled with superstitions, with irrationality, which led to a series of wars in Europe in the 17th and the 18th century, from which the philosophes in France, the philosophers in England and Germany, tried to fashion a new culture that would be based on reason, that would be, with a small letter M, messianic in purpose. A messianic movement is a movement that purports or aspires to curing the malaise of the human condition, to solving the problems of the human condition. And so reason and science were seen as vehicles of this new era, which was going to bring light out of the darkness. And one of the aspects of the Enlightenment was the notion of the oneness of humanity. After all, one of the attributes that all human beings have in common is reason. Reason unites us. If we wanted to be a society in which everyone flourishes, reason is the vehicle, reason and science. There's no such thing as Jewish mathematics or Christian physics. These are based on the laws of nature and rational processes, which are true no matter where you go. And so reason laid out the possibility of a new society in which human dignity was acknowledged and affirmed and tried to be accomplished through rational means, through science and technology, through the new university, where the sciences were seen as coherent with one another, so that the Jewish community that suffered during the Middle Ages in all kinds of ways embraced the processes and the goals of enlightenment. Because one of the features of the Enlightenment was toleration. We're going to tolerate a variety of communities because we're all human beings and have aspects in common. So the early leaders of Judaism in Western Europe embraced the Enlightenment, added on this continuum much more interest in the modern world and its promises than medieval Jews did. So what they did was they adjusted Judaism in order to try to fit into and become part of Western European society. They did it in the following way: by making a distinction between essence and accident. What is it that is essential to Judaism and cannot be compromised and still call it Judaism? So the analogy I sometimes use is the human body. If I had to sacrifice part of my body, I would choose my little finger over my kidneys, because my kidneys are essential to my life as a human being, the very possibility of being alive, whereas my little finger is not. So the reformers tried to make a distinction between what's essential to Judaism and what is, using the term, accidental. What is it that can be dispensed with without undermining the coherence, the integrity of Judaism? And the thing they thought they could dispense with was Jewish law, halakha, laws of kashrut, and so on the assumption that law, halakha, is not universal and universally applicable. It doesn't come down full-blown from heaven. It's a way of managing Jewish life. And in the difficult period of the Middle Ages, when it was dangerous for Jews to interact with general society, not only physically but also spiritually. You eat with your Christian neighbor, you're likely to begin to take on your Christian neighbor's mores, ethics, customs. And therefore, the Jewish tradition developed, so this reasoning goes, ways of keeping the Jews from interacting with non-Jews, both for physical safety and for spiritual safety. So the idea behind this view is the laws are historical artifacts. They were created by the rabbis in order to protect the Jews in the circumstances in which they found themselves in the Middle Ages. Now that we're in a period of enlightenment, of tolerance, we can eat with our neighbors because we share a great deal in common. Yes, we're going to continue to honor Shabbat in our own way, but we share the products of reason with them. So interaction becomes all the more possible. If you think of Jewish law as Jewish ritual, as time-bound and not eternal, you can dispense with it if the times no longer require what the law presents to Jews in Judaism. So the early reformers minimized ritual and emphasized what is eternal and not time-bound, ethics. And so whereas traditional Judaism may have focused on the biblical books of Leviticus, of Numbers, of Deuteronomy, with all the laws as the foundations for the development of Jewish halakha, Reform Judaism shifted its emphasis from those law-bound books to the prophets, because the prophets are interested in social justice, in ethics, in the way we treat one another. Ethics are not time-bound. Love your neighbor as yourself is not a product of sociological analysis. It's always true. So that if one wanted to be a part of Enlightenment European culture with its emphasis on science and reason, don't focus on Leviticus. Focus on Amos. And Amos was the key prophetic book that early reformers focused on. Many Jewish scholars wrote commentaries on Amos because Amos was the book not only that focused on what is universal and not time-bound, it also was a book that bound us to our Christian neighbors, because ethics applies to all of us. So that you can see that where the Orthodox on this continuum were in the 70s, the 80s, in terms of the distribution of Jewish culture and general culture, the Reform Judaism moved the needle down the continuum. I don't know exactly where to place it. Let's just say radical reform was at 10. Hebrew was not used in the service anymore. Sermons modeled themselves on Protestant sermons. After all, Protestantism is the religion of the word. And modern Judaism, I might say, is a kind of Protestant form of Judaism, small p. Catholicism focuses much more on hierarchy and on ritual, the Mass. And one goes to the Mass and one is really quite astonished at the drama, at the music, at the depth, the feeling, the ritual, which is not only touching the mind, it touches the eyes and the hands and so on. So that whereas traditional Judaism is a kind of Catholic form of Judaism, ritual, I'm simplifying. Modern Judaism is much more a Protestant kind of Judaism, with the emphasis on the sermon. We all know the stories of Abba Hillel Silver's Sunday morning sermons, to which people, Jews and non-Jews, poured into the Silver Sanctuary. And the sermon was the centerpiece of the service. The rest of it was read in English. I remember something that as late as 1995, 2000, Susanna Heschel said to me, the only people who are uttering Hebrew in our service is the non-Jewish choir. The Hebrew is sung, and the Jews in the pews are not uttering Hebrew. This is really a function of this ideology of enlightenment, which we call classical Reform Judaism. Now, of course, Reform Judaism has moved the needle back up the continuum as we've introduced all kinds of traditional elements, more Hebrew, more music. One of the things I like to think about in terms of the contrast is when I first started here at the temple, and we were to do a heat analysis of a service, that is, where is the energy, where's the action? The center of the heat in the, I'm not talking about temperature, you can see that, is on the bima. Everything happened from the bima. What we're doing now is, not only is the cantor singing at us, we remember Nanette Canfield, some of us, who was our cantorial soloist. She wasn't Jewish. She had a beautiful voice. She made the service really powerful, but she sang at us. Whereas now, with Cantor Sibo, we sing with her. We march the Torah around the sanctuary. The word is not just enclosed up here on the bima for only the clergy to see. Everybody now can feel the presence of Torah. And it's a tactile activity and not just an intellectual one. We touch the Torah, we kiss it, we see it up close. So Reform Judaism has moved back into the direction of more and more ritual, more traditional Judaism, I think for a variety of reasons which we don't need to go into. So not only is this whole scheme, I think, very, very fascinating, and I very much like the continuum idea because it tells us the ebb and flow, the up and down of the relationship between Judaism, Jews, our particular Judaism, and full Jewish culture and full Enlightenment culture. And we've always tried to move from one extreme to the other, moving closer to one stream or the other. I think of the image of a glass filled with contents. If you think of the contents of the glass as representing Judaism, traditional Judaism filled the glass with Jewish contents, was totally full with Jewish contents. Modern Judaism has reduced from 100% Jewish contents to something less because we've also wanted to participate in modern culture. So one of the points of my going on this long was both to kind of display, I think, this dynamic in graphic terms, but also to bring us back to the prophet Amos. Amos is the key prophet in the key section of the Bible. If we divide the Bible into its three parts, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah, prophets' writings, Orthodox Judaism was focused almost exclusively on the 5 books of Moses. Whereas Reformed Judaism, as I just said, it diminished the role of the middle books, the end of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and shifted some of the emphasis to the second section, the prophets, and primarily Amos, because as we've seen in our study of Amos, Amos is concerned most of all with how we treat one another, and especially how we treat the vulnerable. And Amos is making a kind of statement of the relationship between ethics and ritual, and ties them together. The more we treat the vulnerable badly, the less efficacy we can find in our ritual. Ritual is not for Amos a thing in itself. Its status depends upon our ethical behavior. We can come to the sanctuary and worship God, but if we're treating our neighbors badly, it's of no effect. We just think it is. But its validity is a function of something more important, and that is, let me call it, the horizontal connections between one human being and another, between leadership and society, rather than the vertical connection between human beings and God. So for Amos, the one is the independent, ethics is the independent variable. Ritual is the dependent variable. It depends for its status and validity on something else. Good old Enlightenment ethics. And that's why Amos is so important to classical Reform Judaism. So with that introduction, let's turn back to Amos. We're on chapter 5 today, but I want to review quickly what we've done so far. So you can see in chapter 1, we have this interesting introduction which gives us a lot of information. The words of Amos, a sheep breeder from Tekoa. So Amos comes from rural and not urban areas, okay? A dependency on nature, less dependent upon the structures of urban society. A person from the outskirts can serve as a critic of what happens at the urban center. So the fact that he is a sheep breeder and a tender of sycamore trees, which he says later on, gives him a kind of perspective on the possible or real corruptions of the city. The words of Amos, a sheep breeder from Tekoa. Tekoa is in Judah, the southern kingdom, and not in the northern kingdom, not in Israel, but in Judah. So Amos is going to preach his sermon in the north. So this is a second sense of which he might be seen as an interloper. Not only a rural individual going to an urban area, but a person from the south going to the north, which of course the two are in rivalry with each other, who prophesies concerning Israel. Here Israel is the north, the northern kingdom, in the reigns of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam, the son of Joash of Israel. Okay, so the divided kingdom, kings over both. Uzziah, I think, reigned for something like 52 years, from 790 to 740. So this is in the reign of Uzziah, 2 years before the earthquake. And as I pointed out, scholars seem to think that earthquake was in 740 emphasizing in 753. I just noticed this morning, I don't know what to make of it, but it's tantalizing. 753 is also the traditional year of the founding of Rome. 753 is the year Amos gives this deathless sermon, and it's also the founding of Rome. What could be the connection between the two, or is it just strictly accidental? I can't imagine the connection, although scholars do believe that refugees from the Trojan War, Greeks from the Trojan War, after they flee Troy, some of them came to the Middle East, and that the Philistines, who we know are from an Aegean region, may be some of the refugees from the Trojan War. Trojan War's conclusion is something like 1180, which is pretty much the time that the Israelites come to the land of Israel as well. So there seems to be a connection between Greek culture and Philistine culture, but I can't imagine what the connection between the founding of Rome and Amos is, but to be looked into further. He proclaimed, "The Lord roars from Zion, shouts aloud from Jerusalem, and the pastures of the shepherds shall languish, and the summit of Carmel shall wither." Already a very interesting kind of prologue to Amos's shouting at the people in the name of God. So then we have a series of "for 3 transgressions and for 4." So in verse 3, "For the 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4 I will not revoke it." How to understand that? It may be of the form 3 and more, for 3 and 4. It might be for 3 and not just one more, but several more. Some scholars believe it means 7. For 3 and for 4, for 7 transgressions. Seems to me more poetic than literal. "Because they threshed Gilead," verse 3, "with the threshing boards of iron," and so on. Then verse 6, "For 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not revoke it," because they exiled an entire population. Notice, these are affronts between two peoples that are not Israelite. So this is an indication or an illustration of the idea of the universal God, that God is not just a mountain deity, or the God of Israel is not just the God of one people, but the God of Israel is the God of all peoples. So Amos is a universalist, and I think this is an illustration of it. Verse 9, "For 3 transgressions of Tyre I will, and for 4 I will not revoke it." Verse 11, "For 3 transgressions of Edom I will not revoke it, because he pursued his brother with the sword and repressed all pity." Notice, this is a horizontal relationship that Amos is interested in. How we treat one another, and not ritual transgressions. Verse 13, "For 3 transgressions and for 4 I will not revoke it." Chapter 2, verse 1, "For 3 transgressions of Moab, for 4 I will not revoke it. Because he burned the bones of the king of Edom to lime, I will send down fire upon Moab, shall devour the fortresses of Creot, and Moab shall," and so on. One non-Israelite people ravishing another. So what does this form do? I think it does several things. It's poetic, it's rhythmic. We see the same form over and over again. Of course, it represents the universalist God. It may, if we can think of this as having been preached to a live audience at Bethel, have excited those who heard this. God is punishing other people for their transgressions. And then Amos pulls a surprise right here in verse 4 of chapter 2. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah. And now Amos begins to bring it home. It's not just other people's, it's our people, but it's not quite home yet, because if he's preaching in the north, Judah's in the south, so that there's a crescendo of, what's the word here? Celebration. God is punishing other peoples, some of whom are antagonistic to us. The God of justice is reaping some sort of retribution on those peoples. Oh, and Judah as well. We broke away from Judah. Judah has transgressed, and now God is also punishing them. So there's not only music, not only a heightening of intensity, but an anticipation of the way that God is treating the transgressions of others, until verse 6. Thus says the Lord. Now, can you imagine sitting there at a Shabbat service, let's say Saturday, Shabbat morning, and Amos begins his sermon at 10 o'clock. And it takes him 9 minutes to get to chapter 2, verse 6. By this time, the auditors are in a frenzy of celebration. Look at what is happening to our enemies. Look what is happening to our closest enemy, our brother, Judah, who caused us to break away. And then all of a sudden, Amos socks them. It's you, climactically, that I'm concerned about. And it's you that God is going to be focusing on from now on. I mean, if you think of the rhetoric of a sermon, this is gloriously rhetorical, isn't it? He sucks his auditors in and then surprises them. For 3 transgressions, I'm in verse 6. For 4, I will not revoke it, because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just. You can see why early reformers loved Amos. Okay, this is social justice material. And the needy for a pair of sandals. That's how much you disregard the sanctity, the dignity of human beings. Ah, you who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground, and make the humble walk a twisted course. Father and son go to the same girl. Ethics, social realities, and thereby profane my holy name. They recline by every altar on garments taking in pledge. You remember the garments taking in pledge? If you do take it as collateral for a loan you're giving somebody, you must return it before nightfall. Because as it says in Deuteronomy, in what will the poor sleep? In other words, here it's not just an ethical violation, it's a deeply emotional transgression. Don't you feel the need of the poor who had to give up something of value? So here we have a sense that Amos knows the Jewish tradition. This is sort of an anachronism. There is no Judaism per se. This is pre-Judaism, but in the continuum. Amos, let's put it this way, Amos knows his Torah. Here, Torah, not in the specific sense of a book or a scroll, but in terms of its general sense of teaching. Amos knows the fundamental teachings of his tradition. The prophets are not non-literary. They seem to know something about the past, and they're bringing it to their society. They recline, verse 8, by every altar on garments taking in pledge, and drink in the house of their God wine bought with fines they imposed. Yet Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. You remember back in the Abraham story, when God makes a promise to Abraham, your descendants shall have this land, to which Abraham asks the question. He doesn't ask it, but here's the question that is implied. Why not now? Why don't you just give it to us now? Because God has just said you shall go down in Egypt and be servants for 400 years, then I will bring you out. And the answer God gives is the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. God is a God of justice. The Amorites are on the land. You can't just kick them off for no reason at all. Ethics has something to do with hold on a land. And if you're leading a moral, ethical, social life, you deserve to stay on your land. You can lose that right if you're immoral. And the iniquity of the Amorite doesn't yet rise to the threshold of they don't deserve to stay there anymore. So Abraham, it would be unjust if I gave you the land now. But this is an illusion. I'm not sure it's an illusion. Let me go with that and then wonder about it. An allusion to that biblical story, right? We could say that Amos knows that story way back in Genesis 15. That's not certain, because there may be an oral tradition. Among the things that are bandied about in the society is something about the past. It need not be an allusion to a biblical story, but just the idea that the Amorites, a tradition that the Amorites somehow were there and then no longer were. Yet, verse 9, I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose stature was like the cedars, and who was stout as the oak. As sturdy as the Amorites were, by implication, as you think you are, still my judgment is going to undermine that sturdiness, destroying boughs above and his trunk below. And I brought you up from the land of Egypt. And this is clearly a reminiscence of a traditional story that Amos knows. And I led you through the wilderness 40 years to possess the land of the Amorite. I raised up prophets from among your sons, Nazarites. Notice what Amos is suggesting. The office of prophecy, the role of the Nazarite, are acts of grace. They're gifts. Wouldn't a person who is going astray be thankful for a critic, a friendly critic, a sympathetic critic, to say, look, you recognize what you're doing? How about thinking about changing your ways? Wouldn't a person be glad, as long as the critic is not brutal, for somebody to point out a blindness in that person? That's what the prophets are gifts to Israel, to help bring them back to the right way of living, rather than to continue this road down into decay. And the Nazarites are a gift too. You know, the Nazarite is the one who, in an attempt to be faithful, engages in certain acts of deprivation. No wine, cutting one's hair, and so on, as a model for a fully exemplary life. The Nazarites are few, because only the few can do something so superlatively deferential. But nevertheless, models are gifts to us for how to behave. I mean, think of the great heroes of history. Think of Martin Luther King Jr., for example, or Mandela, who show us how to live fully exemplary lives toward which we might aspire, but very few of us can reach. So, I gave you prophets. Oh, thank you very much. Prophets who came and rebuked us. Yes, that's a gift. I think that's what Amos is saying here. I raised up prophets from among your sons and Nazarites from among young men, is that not so, O people of Israel, says the Lord? But you made the Nazarites to drink wine. You couldn't handle an ideal life, so you corrupted them. And you ordered the prophets not to prophesy. Those who spoke the truth don't tell us the truth. We don't want to hear it. I will slow your movements as a wagon is slowed when it is full of cut grain, and so on and so on. So this is the beginning of Amos's sermon to the people based upon the universal God who is concerned fundamentally with ethics. Chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3, the first and second verses are deservedly famous because here Amos is questioning, we might say, the traditional view of the chosen people, chosen for glory, chosen for singularity. The Jewish people are better than anybody else. We're the chosen people and you're not. And Amos turns it upside down. Yes, I chose you. You are singular. But you're chosen for special responsibility. The special burden of responsibility. And of course, responsibility has in it the word response. If you're responsible, you have your ear to what's going on beyond you. And if you see people suffering, you must respond. And if you respond well, you're being responsible. And therefore, chosenness is not a special glory, it's a special burden. You alone, verse 2, have I singled out of all the families of the earth. That's why I call you to account for all your iniquities. You're going to be punished even more for doing what others do. Because I chose you, as the prophet Isaiah would say, as a light to the nations, to help people come out of the darkness of the dungeon and into the light of healthy living. And then verse 3, we looked at a couple of weeks ago, this wonderful unit of its own, which is, I think, to be understood as the idea of cause and effect. We can make a distinction between effects and events. Events are isolated occurrences. Effects are the result of causes. So an interesting question is, are certain events also effects? And what Amos wants to suggest is, yes, they are. We live in an arena of cause and effect. Can two walk together, verse 3, without having met? The effect is, we notice two people walking down the sidewalk together, from which we can infer its cause. It has a cause, doesn't it? If two people are walking down the street together, do we think they have nothing at all to do with one another? Don't we think that they've made some arrangement to meet? Otherwise, I mean, they might pass one another for a moment, but if they're walking down the street for a long period of time, a logical inference is there's a cause for it. They agree. Does a lion roar in the forest when it has no prey? Does a great beast let out a cry from its den without having made a capture? I'm not suggesting that these are airtight arguments, but in a casual sense, I think without being too rigorous about it, we would say, yes, if a lion roars out, there must be a cause for it. So Amos is building an argument that for every occurrence we see or hear, there is some prior, though possibly invisible cause. The cause can be inferred with some certitude without actually having seen or witnessed it. Verse 5, does a bird drop on the ground in a trap with no snare there? Does a trap spring up from the ground unless it has caught something? Notice, just as in chapter 1, there is a heightening, a crescendo of intensity. Amos is drawing us in to this idea that every event has a cause. In a way, we're mesmerized by the repetition of this same idea with very visual and dramatic elements. When a ram's horn is sounded in a town, do the people not take alarm? So we have a couple of ideas emerging here. Entrapment, the entrapment of the bird, and fear, alarm, okay? Fear and entrapment. Can misfortune come to a town if the Lord has not caused it? Again, I think there's rhetorical genius here. He has drawn us into this idea of cause and effect, and all of a sudden he brings God into the picture. And we might say, well, this is a move that in a way is suspect. How can he bring automatically, look, if two people walk together, it's who would say they didn't make an agreement to do so? If something is caught in a trap, if something screams out from a trap, somebody said it. So he's mesmerizing us into feeling that, yes, what we see is certain, and therefore the cause of what we see must also be certain, setting us up for this surprising move, because he wants us to agree, now that the momentum is moving toward this, that yes, God is behind it. He has slipped in his premise that God is the ultimate cause of what happens. This is not a logical argument. This is a rhetorical argument. Rhetoric is how to persuade, the means of persuasion. I've often talked about Aristotle's view of rhetoric. Rhetoric is an art which seeks to find in any given situation the available means of persuasion. Amos wants to persuade the people that they're in trouble. He sits back on his couch and he says to himself, how am I going to get this across? I know, I'll do a syllogism. I'll start with all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Who could deny that? But for those not sympathetic to logical argument, that's not going to be the best means of persuasion. Why don't I do this? Why don't I get going a notion that for every event there's a cause, and then get the people ready to say yes before they can say, wait a minute, should I swallow this, right? So Amos's worldview is slipped in here in a powerfully rhetorical way. Verse 6, when a ram's horn is sounded in a town, do the people not take alarm? There's the fear factor again. Can misfortune come to a town? Misfortune is the effect. What's the cause? It's obvious that it's God. Can a misfortune come to a town if the Lord has not caused it? Indeed, my Lord God does nothing without having revealed his purpose to his servants, the prophets. If the prophets are speaking, what is the background for that? Obviously, God has called us. So I think this is a quite remarkable mode of getting a message across to an audience that may be receptive to it. A lion has roared. Who can but fear? My Lord God has spoken. Who can but prophesy? In other words, Amos is also saying here that not only is God behind the activities of nature and of history, but also, given the notion of entrapment, the bird in the trap, the prophet is trapped. If God calls a prophet, who can resist it? And so Amos is recognizing something that Jeremiah talks about at great length. Jeremiah's response to God essentially is, call somebody else. I want out of this. I've got a fire burning in my belly, and it doesn't give me any rest because I must respond to your insisting that I go and prophesy to the king and to the nobles. I don't want to do this. But Amos is saying here, once a prophet is called, he or she has no choice. It's a vocation in the sense of being called without possible response. So, a wonderful passage. Don't you think as we're reviewing these early chapters of Amos that we not only have powerful ideas, a sense of moral rectitude, of crisis, but Amos delivers it in a very artful way. Chapter 1 for 3 and for 4, culminating in Judah and then in Israel, and now with this whole notion of cause and effect, slipping in the universalistic idea that God is sovereign over everything. God is the cause of all effects. Let's look at chapter 4. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, on the hill of Samaria, who defraud the poor, who rob the needy. Exploitation, economic exploitation. Who say to your husbands, bring and let's carouse. My Lord God swears by his holiness. Behold, the days are coming. And by the way, the word holy, I think can mean, it's a very vexed question in the literature. But the holy, I think, in simple terms can mean singular and elevated. A holy place is a singular place among all the places in the environs, and it's elevated. It's not only different and unique, it's elevated. It's more intense than other things. So if God is swearing by his holiness, this is the background for calling God's people to act in a singular way. And to act in a singular way, in Amos's terms, is to act morally. Moral action is our response to the holiness of God. This is the way to be holy. And don't you see once again how attractive this would be to early Reform Jewish leaders who want to bring the Jews into the Enlightenment world, dominated, say, by Immanuel Kant, who makes, Kant wrote a little treatise with the title, What is Enlightenment? And the motto of that book, of that article is, dare to use your own reason. We are autonomous, and we have the power to reason and to figure things out. And one of the things we're figuring out is what Kant calls the categorical imperative. Do something because it's right, not necessarily because it's useful. So the reformers are finding in Amos something similar to the rationalism of the primacy of reason of Enlightenment culture. My God swears, verse 2, by his holiness, behold, days are coming upon you when you will be carried off in baskets, and to the last one in fish baskets, and taken out of the city, each one through a breach straight ahead, and flung on a refuse heap. Those of you who are, at verse 1, cows of Bashan, I think here he doesn't mean necessarily fat, but he means bloated with the accumulation of wealth, of goods, taken from the needy. You have become bloated, and you will be carried away in baskets. Ellen?
I'm wondering,
That's a great point. Who are the prophets today? I mean, I think we can think Martin Luther King is a prophet. Nelson Mandela is a prophet. I happen to like very much the columnist for the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof, who goes into areas that may not be in our purview, our level of concern, and he talks about the depredations and the suffering and the way in which we are exploitative. I'm not sure that, well, it raises the question of, do you need to call upon God? Is belief in God or invoking God a necessary condition for being a prophet? And I think from my point of view, the answer is no. If prophets are calling us to a higher mode of living, does it matter what the origin of their call is? In other words, it seems to me prophets are much more interested. I may be on the way to disagreeing with myself, but let's try it out. Let's try it out. How can I know if I'm right or wrong until I go there? I think if you asked Amos, he would say, yes, of course God is at the foundation because we live in a theistic universe where God is at the center and the source of all meaning and being. But I think Amos might concede that belief in God by itself is not sufficient. That God, in a way, is, I think for Amos it would be a necessary source of the moral life. But I think for Amos, God is, I don't know how to say this, a premise for what really matters, how we treat one another. And therefore, doesn't matter what the premise is, as long as you're doing the prophetic thing. You're calling upon people in two ways, to a higher form of moral living, and to rebuke them for resisting that path. And the prophets are concerned with behavior, certainly social behavior. There's a controversy about whether these prophets are anti-ritual per se, or whether or not they are not anti-ritual per se. They just don't want us to be beguiled by living a ritual life. Living a ritual life is not enough, even though ritual accompanied by good deeds is perfectly valid. It's unclear. Sometimes their rebuke of the ritual life seems absolute. They are resisting Leviticus. Or are they just putting Leviticus in its proper place as a part of the full life? So, for me, Nicholas Kristof. Who are some of the others? Abraham Joshua Heschel, for example. You remember when he marched in Selma, he said, I felt that my feet were praying. What he was engaged in as an activity was a prayer, and therefore something to be desired. Gary? It raises a good question of who has the right to call one another to account. And, I'm going to look very quickly at Psalm 137. Let's look at it very quickly, because I think there's a response here to Gary's question. Psalm 137. It's the only of the 150 Psalms that we can date. Psalm 137 can't have been written before the onset of the Babylonian exile. The other Psalms we just can't date. By the rivers of Babylon there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung our lives, for our captors asked us there for songs. Our tormentors for amusement. God, remember that word, tormentors. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at the happiest hour. Glorious poetry, memorable poetry. But then the psalmist does something problematic, we might say. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall. This is why I point out the word tormentors. How they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. A blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. Okay, pretty gory. But notice in verse 7, the psalmist calls upon God to punish the tormentors, which strikes me as meaning we want to do it, but we're going to be a little careful as to whether or not we are the ones to do it. We're calling on God to do it. Now, we might find that appalling, but at least in response to Gary's question about whether anti-Semites are holding us to account, the psalmist at least thinks that we are not the ones to hold each other fully to account, especially in terms of something so dastardly as that. So I guess that would be part of a response to it. It would be really problematic if there was some validity in that idea, wouldn't there? But there are two things happening, we might say. We always need to be called into account. And there are anti-Semites. Are they connected? And I think we all would want to say, oh gosh, no. Yeah. Jim?
In response to what Ellen was saying, the resistance is so overwhelming. We may have heard yesterday somebody say something that would promise or about the resistance is so incredible, especially now with social media and the subtle input of all these what I call negative ideas. It's hard to know if there is a prophet. There's plenty of false prophets. But I think if you go back to chapter 2, the line before 9, it's the top of page 1018. It says, wine bought with wines they imposed. So I think that's a very important line, because what it tells you is, as the government or the king or whatever becomes in charge, it quickly becomes corrupt. And it's a vicious circle. And I don't know how we get out of it, the way the society is. And so the herd mentality going along with the government will resist a prophet like Martin Luther King. Because our government told him he was a bad guy. They were espousing him all over. He's a communist, he's this and that. It was pretty hard to actually listen to the guy. And I think that line, though it's just a few words, tells you the horrendous power of a corrupt government.
Right. So Jim is making the point that if those in power want to be corrupt, they can certainly use their rhetorical advantages and so on, their power advantages, to do what they want to do and get the masses to go along with them. it reminds me of what I think some of the founders of America said, that a society to work depends upon virtuous leaders. The laws do not enforce themselves. They require people who somehow feel the sanctity of the law, the sanctity of process. I mean, I've always thought that democracy is more about procedure. It's a procedural form of government rather than a substantive form of government. It's the how that matters. And unless we affirm the dignity, the importance of the process, we're going to fall apart. And those who want us to fall apart are attacking the process, undermining the process, which does not enforce itself. That's the point that you're making. If you've got power and there are not those who lend dignity to the process, we're really without resources. And I think, we could say that in a way that's the position we find ourselves in today, right? And I suppose that's one of the uses, if I can put it this way, of belief in a God. That God is the final arbiter and enforcer, because we cannot rely upon the virtue of human beings. It's a reason in question for me, not only about what's the content of belief in God, but what are the uses of a belief in God? How does it function? And even if we may have difficulty with who is God, do we abandon some notion of an ultimate authority at our peril? Of course there are problems with an ultimate authority. No, I think you're right. And that's why Amos, of course, is invoking God and using powerful poetry and rhetoric, trying to get into our hearts as well as into our minds.
To go back to the question why there are no prophets, I was wondering what was the influence of the poets in their own time?
The poets, the prophets.
The prophets. I mean, was Amos listened to, or what percentage was listening to? Was he considered a lunatic, or, I mean, we don't know.
Well, we do have in chapter 7, which we'll get to at some point, where Amos, let's just look at it now that Maya's raised the question. Maya's question is just for live streamers, is what was the impact of the prophets? How were they regarded? So, verse 10 of chapter 7, Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, which is where Amos went to preach his sermon, so to speak, sent this message to King Jeroboam of Israel. Amos is conspiring against you within the house of Israel. The country cannot endure the things he is saying. For Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel shall be exiled from its soil. So Amos is now in danger. I don't think, though I don't know for sure, that anything comes of it. But certainly Amos is seen as a threat to the hierarchy. Not only the priest, but so Amos's potency is acknowledged, because if he weren't seen as potent, he wouldn't be seen as a threat. And the king, the chief of police, is now being called in terms of what Amos is doing. So Amos responds, let's just read it. Amaziah also said to Amos, Seer, off with you to the land of Judah. Earn your living there and do your prophesizing there. But don't ever prophesy again at Bethel, for it's a king's sanctuary and a royal palace. Prophets don't belong here. Danger for Amos. Amos answered Amaziah, I'm not a prophet. I'm not a prophet's disciple. Let me see if I can find the Hebrew there. lo navi anochi velo ben navi. So ben here is translated as disciple, literally son of. Bar, which is the Aramaic for ben, bar mitzvah, son of a commandment. And we have no idea what that means. So the word ben can have several meanings. Here, a prophet's ben here is what we would call an adjective of relation. He's related to being a prophet, namely by being one. So he's saying, I'm not a prophet, don't put me in that category. So to Maya's question, we see that Amos is in danger, that he's challenging some of the foundations of society. When we get to Jeremiah, Jeremiah is thrown in jail. What about other prophets? Elijah is rebuked by Jezebel and has to flee the community. So it's clear that being a prophet is a very dangerous activity. Are any of them killed? I don't know. Yeah, Stuart.
I think that prophecy is determined after the fact, long after the fact, by the fact that we have the books of the prophets. There probably were dozens of prophets who never got a book written.
Right? Now, Stuart is making an interesting point. The point is that prophets are not acknowledged as such in their time, but only in retrospect. But I think that it's complicated in this sense. I think I think Amos was acknowledged. Well, the question is, what's the status of the word prophet? Is it merely a description? I would say no. Amos is saying the answer is no. It's not just you don't graduate from college with a degree in prophecy. A prophet is one who makes pronouncements, and those pronouncements can either be ignored, accepted, or rebuked. So that when we read that Jeremiah is thrown in jail, he's recognized as a prophet, not in the sense called by God, but in the sense of troublemaker. That's what prophets are doing. They're making trouble for the society, calling them to attention. So I think there's a way in which Amos's words would not have been preserved unless when he spoke them, they were regarded as important, like them or not. Because somebody had to write down or at least transmit what they thought were Amos's words. I mean, one of the things scholars do with the prophetic books is they try to make a distinction between the authentic word and editorial expansions. So if I think that X is a prophet, and I think that the word is worth preserving, I may write it down and try to, let's say, get it published. But somebody else may take up what I've written down and say, you know, there's an omission here. There's something that's cloudy and confusing. I'm going to clarify it so that between verse 6 and 7, an editor who wants to make clear what verse 6 says adds verse 7 and pushes 7 to 8. So that I think the very fact that Amos's words are preserved suggests that already early on, his words were acknowledged as worth preserving. That is important. Whether or not we're getting echt Amos the genuine Amos, I think the answer to that question is yes and no. We can see the kernel of what Amos is purported to have said, but I think, look, if we find a bit of a digression in a verse of a line of thought, that looks like an editorial insertion. So one can begin to think about this. So I think that the prophets do make an impact in their time. Otherwise, nobody would think of transmitting it. And if nobody transmitted it in generation 1 or 2, it's gone. And here I think Stuart is exactly right. There are undoubtedly lots of prophets about whom we know nothing, because their words may have been as powerful, as authentic as Amos's words, but that prophet just didn't have the luck to have a secretary, to have somebody who says, wait a minute here, we can't forget this stuff. Jeremiah has a secretary, his name is Baruch, and there are apocryphal books of Baruch, right? Amos, without having anybody acknowledged or identified, must have had, at least within 50 years of Amos's death, written it down. So known in his day, but preserved for the generations, requires some ongoing acknowledgement, because after all, the book of Amos may have gone through generations of oral transmission and not really written down for hundreds of years. And so the ravages of time, right, the accidents of time, Amos may not have been lucky. There may have been a breach, a gap. Once you get a gap, it's gone. So I think it's both, in their time and also down through time, because which of the prophets are preserved and which are not. Ben Sira was regarded, I think, as a prophet, but he had the disadvantage of having his book come to be known after the canon was closed. So he's not in the canon, though the rabbis quote Ben Sira all the time. Authority without canonization. Canonization is a mode of preservation. Authority is very fragile. If one generation doesn't like a certain guy or gal, it's gone if it's only orally transmitted. Maybe that's overstated. Irv.
I'm gonna have some fun here.
Okay.
Troublemaker having an impact on his time. Was Spinoza a prophet?
Oh, was Spinoza a prophet? That's a great question. Irv's question is, if prophets are troublemakers, are all troublemakers prophets? Well, look, I mean, now we would need a definition of prophecy. If prophets speak a powerful word that makes an impact and is a word that attempts to elevate society, is that a prophet? And if the answer is yes, then Spinoza's a prophet. I mean, Spinoza is one of the architects of the modern world. The separation of church and state, God and nature. One of Spinoza's great insights, we might say, is that God equals nature. And Spinoza, for all of his naturalism and, in traditional terms, atheism, after all, he was excommunicated from the Jewish community, Spinoza was called by, I believe, was it Novalis, the Romantic poet Novalis, as a God-intoxicated person, because he believed in a sense, the divinity of nature. If you're looking for the issue of reward and punishment, you could say, for traditional terms, if I do the bad or wrong thing, I'm going to be punished, let's say, by God. For Spinoza, if you do the wrong thing, you're punished by nature. If you don't follow the laws of nature, you're going to be hurt. If you don't understand how a stove works, you're in danger. So I think Spinoza, as an architect of the modern world, may count as a prophet. It raises the question, do you have to be a rhetorician? Do you have to be a person who has a gift for proclaiming, either in words or in deeds? Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote a lot of things, but if he's a prophet, his prophecy centers on his actions. Spinoza retreated from society. Once he was excommunicated, he disappeared, so to speak, and wrote his books. So in that sense, if you had said to Spinoza, are you a prophet? He would have said, Amos went into the marketplace boldly and did what he did. I'm not interested in going into the marketplace. So in that sense, he may not have been. But in terms of content, but in that sense, Aristotle was a prophet. I mean, now we're reduced to saying those who have a great impact become our prophets. And that's too broad, isn't
Does
it?
it have to be in the religious context in order to qualify as a prophet?
Nicholas Kristof, if Nicholas Kristof is a prophet,
If you say so.
well, he is rebuking his society, calling us to account, and caring for the neglected. Those are the two things Amos does. Now, he invokes God, but one might say if one invokes absolute values without actually calling them God-inspired, if you're a person who believes that the neglected, the vulnerable, the suffering, the weak, have as much dignity as you and I, that's an absolute principle. Does it have to have been delivered by God in order to have the status of a God-inspired principle? And I would say no. I mean, one of the ways God functions is in a variety of ways. Answer of prayers, source of morality for traditional. So in a way you could say that God is not indispensable in moral terms, though God may still be indispensable in other terms. So the persistence of God's, the idea of God, may in a way be protected by the variety of ways in which, for Immanuel Kant, reason replaces God. You can know the truth if it survives the application of a rational process. So I would say Nicholas Kristof, just to use him here, satisfies the criteria, even though he may not invoke God. Right. And what is Amos doing here? He's personifying the ideas of absolute justice. He's giving it a living source. But is it crucial to have the living source to recognize the power of absolute justice? Ram.
If he can have fun, I can have fun too.
I think we're all having fun.
I'm just reflecting on how often God uses those of like the agrarian profession to speak for him. And so I grew up pretty agrarian, and so I was just realizing it's just like, well, I bet they had accents back then, and he was probably illiterate.
He was probably, I see.
Illiterate, and so it's just kind of like, there's kind of like almost like a joke that God is playing here, just like, I have this illiterate guy who's a sheep breeder, probably sounds different than all the people in the city, and the fact that, like you were saying, somebody actually took him seriously, like that's the next
point. I mean, I think what Rem is wondering is, well, how specific do you want to be? Are you saying really that the joke, so to speak, is that prophets come from very unlikely backgrounds? It certainly serves a rhetorical, it's not surprising in a sociological sense, I might say, because a person from beyond the city, let's just assume the city is where high culture exists, that these are the people who are likely to be, as outsiders, critics of what goes on in the city. So one could say the fact that he's an agrarian, doesn't have the language of the city, may have been illiterate, may be not a set of sufficient reasons for his being a prophet, but certainly intriguing, because you might not get a guy who grows up in the palace being a prophet, unless your name is Moses. A counter tradition. So I guess I'm making the point here that it's not irrational that these people come from the periphery. And also, I think there's something about the surprise. We can't predict who might rise to the occasion. Therefore, there's something unpredictable about the rise of a prophet. Now, we have prophets from different places. I mean, Isaiah is a man of the city and a man of the temple, so he comes right from within, and he rebukes the people from within. So, but interesting point. What is it that is likely or not likely to produce prophets? Yeah, Scott.
This is a very sticky definition. That's gonna, I don't think we're even close to a definition of a prophet yet, because it's confused at this point with philosophers and sages, and the impact thing can't really be the definition. I don't think Mordecai is considered a prophet, but he was a sage, and he was.
Who?
Mordecai. He was impactful. He complained about the state of things, the administration of the king, and yet that is not what made him. It was not his impact. It was his actions as an advisor. But the philosophers throughout the ages. I mean, the ancient Greeks, the modern times, have had impact.
Yeah.
Considerable impact.
Right. So Scott is raising the question.
Definition.
It's a very important.
One little thing, since we're having fun, just to highlight Stuart's point about a prophet in his own times. Let's assume for a second that Martin Luther King is. There was a very cynical view of that on the show The Simpsons one time. They were driving by a billboard and it said, "Today we honor Martin Luther King, tomorrow we don't." And it's kind of true that, they come and go.
They come and go.
Maybe adopted later.
So you're raising the question of definition, and it's a tough one. I'll just tell you briefly, if I can, what the modern philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein says about definitions. Because he's opposed to the idea of an essential definition. So he raises the question of what is a game? What's a game? And he argues in the following ways. Let's see if you can follow me. Game one has attributes or features A, B, C, and D. Game two has features B, C, D, E. Game three, C, D, E, F. Game four, D, E, F, G. Game 5, E, F, G, H. Game 5 has nothing in common with Game 1, but it does have something in common with Game 4. In other words, what Wittgenstein is arguing against is you can describe things without wanting to reach for an essentialist definition that every game must have features X, Y, and Z. because Game 5 and Game 1 don't have anything in common, and yet Game 5 has something in common with Game 4. So there's an interconnection. What he calls these are family resemblances. So, I think we have identified some of the features of prophecy without saying that we've exhausted the category. Irv is posing Spinoza. You're posing the idea of yes today, no tomorrow. So I think it would be futile to try to get to what are the essential features of anyone who someone would call a prophet. That doesn't mean we're without resources. We've talked, I think, at great length about prophets here and gotten some good ideas about it. Yes? What about who? Yeah. Zelensky. That's right. It's easy to say yes. The problem with rushing to yes is that if most anybody can be a prophet, you've got a definition that has no use. The more a definition includes, the more dilute the definition. So you don't want to let everybody in. My great uncle was really a fine ball player. Does he belong in the Hall of Fame? If you ask me, yes. If you ask Flo, her person, pretty soon everybody's in the Hall of Fame. And that can't be, even though we may not be able to say who is definitely out of the running. It's a good question. Now they have a veterans committee, as you know, that people who were ignored and who have run out of time, you got to, I think, within 10 years of retire. Let's go back and look at them. So that's the problem with, we don't want to define people out of the category very easily, but nor do we want to say everybody who we like. Zelensky is certainly bold, and he's been effective, and he cares about a value, the integrity of Ukraine. In that sense, he's a values guy. Willie Mays is definitely not a prophet, but great nonetheless. Some people are definitely not prophets. Ellen, and then I think we'll stop. I'm sorry?
I'm going to nominate
Al Gore. Send a letter of recommendation to me, and I'll think about it. Okay, so next week we're going to continue with Amos. You can see how exciting the book of Amos really is for a very short peek. I'll see you next week, and try to make the what? The annual meeting tomorrow. Shabbat Shalom. I'm doing okay. Yeah. How about you? Good. Let's do it.
It's a tangential question. So if the pro-enlightenment, proto-reform Jews like Amos because of his focus on ethics, what about the fact that he got to that focus not through rhetoric, reason, logic? Well, not through rhetoric, not through reason and logic, because it was God. So how influenced were they by the legitimacy of God causing as being the ultimate cause versus science and rationalism, the different natural causes, and how did this impact their resonance for Amos?
Well, I do think, in fairness to the reformers, and I probably should emphasize it, I think they had strong belief in God. I think they were theists. God's interest about that, yes.
That's fine, okay.
So,
I didn't know where they are on that spectrum. I mean, whether they're really Orthodox Jews who are looking to get a foot into this world and get out of the ghetto and be accepted and be safer by not assimilating, but by being not the other, versus how much a rejection of the old ways of Leviticus.
I'm not sure what your question is.
So I don't know where the people who started Reform Judaism and more emphasis on action and less emphasis on the law, how they perceive themselves. Was it expediency? Was it this is the way we're going to survive, which is this stuff's outmoded?
Right. I certainly think there's an expediency factor, because I think they recognize that Jews were leaving Judaism, so to speak, in great numbers, and therefore how can we hold them back? So we have to appeal to them and assume they still want to be Jews, but it's going to have to be a revised version of Judaism. I think they also had their own convictions and commitments to Judaism, but were struggling for a proper way of doing it. So, I mean, is the merger, what's the combination of conviction and convenience?
We're in that same situation right now.
No, it really is, and I think we would say that convenience, maybe that's an unfair word for what we're doing. We recognize the need, and aside from the values, we better find a way to preserve ourselves and not in 15 years to be two congregations of 150 each. So, practicality, and it has to work, doesn't it? I mean, even the traditional rabbis, you know, they're making adjustments to the law over and against need, much slower, much more reluctantly, but they certainly do change. I mean, after all, the Orthodox and Zionism, that they were unalterably opposed